Does the cultivar affect taste? Are people going to eat the food that you're interested in selling them on because you say it's protected? Delivery, logistics and distribution, it's a huge problem. Clinician buy-in. Here's one of my pet peeves. Doctors like to prescribe drugs and do operations. Again, with all due respect to practicing physicians here, nutritionists and dietitians and many people like me like to talk about using foods to cure illnesses. So it's very difficult to get physicians to get off the shoulder of the drug companies and prescribe a different diet. Control of food product integrity. Tennille has mentioned this already, and you're all, I think, aware of some of the challenges. This can be a big issue, but it can all be dealt with. All of the things that may contaminate your powder, your food, etc., can be analyzed microbiologically, by HPLC, chemically. All of these, there's no voodoo, there's no black magic there. It can all be done, but it costs money. Safety, responsibility, and liability, I won't dwell on that. As I said, I mentioned the regulatory paradigm shift. Is it a food or a drug? I've already mentioned this. We, in writing, indicated that we would not welcome participation of drug companies in development of a food-based chemopreventive approach. However, who's going to pay for it then? I mean, this is an important question. Most of you don't have deep enough pockets to fund clinical trials. They're very expensive. We maintain that there is a huge amount of money in the food network, so to speak. Food manufacturers, packers, distributors, formulators, retailers, and suppliers, including seed suppliers. And we believe, and I would propose to you, I'd be glad to fight with you about it, argue with you about it, we believe that some of this sector should fund some of the chemoprotection trials. And when you ask if there's enough money in the food industry, hell yes, excuse my French. It's the third biggest industry in the world, second only to transportation, cars and trucks and trains and boats, and oil. So there's a huge amount of money in the food industry. And I'm not just talking about McDonald's and the highly processed food side of it, I'm talking about the food industry as a whole. Unfortunately, as most of you are aware, they don't do a heck of a good job in introducing healthy foods. These are the top 10 foods from a couple of years ago. And I see one, arguably two products that you might say are healthy. Pistachio nuts, of course, the big bump there is all the marketing blitz and Palm Wonderful. They have all sorts of fancy marketing and they charge 20 times more than they should for the nuts. Greek yogurt. Some of you might argue that that's healthy. I agree. But other than that, I mean, this is not healthy food that they're making their fortunes on. I mentioned this already, but just as Hippocrates said, let thy food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. I think, again, I'm preaching to the choir here. So, I'd like to go through very quickly 3 examples of the sorts of trials that we've done. And again, you'll see in a minute that some of this translates directly to what could be done with moringa. The first one, we used fresh broccoli sprouts. This is actually a colleague at UCLA, and he took broccoli sprouts and put them in a blender and made smoothies and gave them to a number of people orally. So 3 days of broccoli sprouts. Each day they got broccoli sprouts. On the 4th day, he used a neti pot, the nasal lavage, and he rinsed some loose cells out of the nasal canal, the nose, and looked at those cells to determine whether protective phase 2 enzymes were induced. And holy mackerel, they were, big time. And so there was a dose-dependent effect. So the more broccoli sprout homogenate on the bottom line, these people got in their diet, well, as an administered bolus, the more they got, the more of an increase they had in, I'm showing 4 phase 2 protective enzymes here. 2 of them, by the way, GSTM1 and GSTP1, are directly involved in the production of glutathione. And he just measured 4 of them because they were the easiest ones to measure. But again, eat it and look at cells in a remote part of the body, and you know, they're interested in airway irritation, asthma, and allergy. And this is with 65 normal subjects. I should mention that this group, we're working with a follow-up with this group, and it's about to be published. It may actually be published today, in which they actually took diesel exhaust particles and challenged the upper airways of a number of people in Los Angeles. The pollution's not quite as bad there as in some places like Shanghai and Beijing, but it's pretty bad. So they have artificial diesel, well, it's real diesel exhaust particles. They infiltrate into the nose, and they're administering a broccoli sprout extract and asking, are these people protected? Let's go on to the next one. I want to show you just two separate studies that deal with this issue of Helicobacter infection that I mentioned. So the first one was by a friend of ours in Michigan, and when she read we had a paper in 2002 that showed that in a test tube, not in people, but in a test tube, sulforaphane from broccoli sprouts killed Helicobacter, and it killed Helicobacter from 45 different clinical isolates, from 45 different subjects obtained from my colleague in France, who's a gastroenterologist. And it killed Helicobacter that was resistant to 1 or 2 of the commonly used antibiotics that are used but don't always cure people of the infection. And so when Dr. Silverman read about this, she took it upon herself to do a study with a number of people and reported that 7 out of 9 people, ultimately 6 out of 9, were cured completely of Helicobacter. Frankly, we went out and visited with her and liked her very much, but it sounded too good to be true. Maybe it is, but in her hands, this is the way it worked. So we did a follow-up study. Before I get to the follow-up study, I just want to show you, though, in a test tube, this is a different follow-up study. In a test tube again, we then showed that sulforaphane from broccoli sprouts was effective against 25 different Helicobacter strains. On the far right, and this was published in 2005, you can see isothiocyanate from Moringa. And it turns out that the isothiocyanate from Moringa is every bit as active against Helicobacter as sulforaphane. And all the others, you can see the plant names up on top, represent isothiocyanates from other cruciferous vegetables. So we knew we had a hero in Moringa at the time, and we would like to be able to do a clinical trial with Moringa on Helicobacter. We haven't had funding for it yet. So, in fact, there looked like there are 3 ways in which the Moringa or the broccoli isothiocyanates can attack this disease. Helicobacter affects, I don't know if I put it on here, 55% of the population in the world. In Japan, just post-World War II, it affected about 100% of people. I'm not sure what the level of infection, the percentage of infected people is in the Philippines. I'm curious to know. I should have checked. But and in some countries, levels of infection are much lower. But this bacterium is recognized as a carcinogen by the World Health Organization. And people who are infected with it absolutely have a dramatically increased risk of gastric carcinoma, stomach cancer. So we've shown that we can kill it in a test tube directly. We've also shown that it elevates phase 2 enzymes and protects an animal system against chemically induced stomach tumors. And just this year we published that it also inhibits the major enzyme which allows Helicobacter to gain a foothold in your stomach if you're infected. So we are most certainly anxious to pursue this with Moringa with clinical trials, but have not yet. We skipped through that. We did do a trial with a colleague in Japan, in Tsukuba, Japan, in which we had 25 subjects in a broccoli sprout arm and 25 in a control arm. Alfalfa sprouts were doing 8 weeks of feeding daily, 70 grams per day of broccoli sprouts. We collected a lot of blood and a lot of urine, and stool samples and breath tests to determine if people were infected. And the results were not as dramatic as we had hoped, but they were statistically significant, and they showed decreased antigen, or decreased presence of Helicobacter shed in the stool, decreased urea breath test, that's the breath indicator of infection, and decreased indicators of inflammation to the stomach. Interestingly, when people stopped taking broccoli sprouts, the levels went back to normal. Okay, I mentioned cultural acceptability. And again, I think this relates back to Moringa. In Japan, people are very attuned to eating fresh broccoli sprouts, fresh vegetables. In China, where we've done a large number of other trials, they're not. And most vegetables are cooked, deep fried or wok fried, etc. So we had to develop, and we may find if you approach other markets, and you have to modify the format in which you deliver your Moringa. But we found that we produced something which we call broccoli sprout extract. It's a freeze-dried water extract of these sprouts. And of course, when it's freeze-dried, it can be put in a gel cap and give it to people. People that like taking drugs or supplements and not eating healthy food can do that. And there, of course, there are a lot of issues involved with this. And I can give you these. By the way, I should say, give Moringaling these slides so that they can be made available if people are interested. But because I don't want to go through each of these points right now. But we have published this more extensively in a paper a year ago. So we now actually are involved with about 25 trials, or have been involved with about 25 clinical trials worldwide. About half of them require formal permission from the FDA to execute them. As I think you mentioned, most of you are aware, if you are treating or intending to treat a disease, you've got to get permission. If you are just doing a study which asks how much of the material gets into the body, you may not have to get complete FDA permission. I've listed here, again, I won't dwell on them, I won't speak to each of them, but I've listed the types of studies that we're involved with, and many of them involve non-cancer endpoints. That's the point I wanted to make. So we are looking at cancer prevention, looking at biomarkers of cancer, but we're also looking at things like asthma. We're looking at autism with a trial that's just concluding at Harvard University, and it turns out that the mechanism that there's a biologically plausible reason that autism severity might actually be influenced by these isothiocyanates. And so we're very excited to see how that trial turns out. COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and on and on. And I mentioned that we have a number of trials that we've done in China looking at liver cancer. Liver cancer is caused by a number of things, including aflatoxin contamination of grain. It's been a big problem in rural China, parts of rural China, because peanuts and corn that are grown by subsistence farmers have high levels of aflatoxin. People get liver cancer. Our trial in China was in an area where 1 out of every 10 people die of liver cancer. Fortunately, because of industrialization and electrification in rural China, this is becoming less of a problem, but what do you know? Air pollution is becoming a huge problem. So we've actually been looking at the effects of broccoli sprouts on both air pollution and liver cancer. Skip, this is just a summary from the abstract I gave your foundation. Let's get on to Moringa specifically. I went to Google Trends and looked at the popularity of Moringa. How many hits one finds from Moringa over the last 9 or 10 years. And so you're probably not surprised that everything you're doing has driven up the popularity of Moringa over the years. Yay. This is somewhat random. I then decided, let's see how that compares, because Google Trends doesn't give you really numbers, it just gives you like 1 to 100. I then decided, let's compare it to something else. So I picked the space station. I don't know why. So Moringa is actually more popular than the space station nowadays. But chocolate is far more popular than Moringa. And guess what? Paris Hilton's not so popular anymore. Moringa is more popular than she is. So, I was trying to get an idea of sort of level of interest over the years. This review that I did in 2005, which Manny so kindly mentioned, is really just a review. We may have a few bits of original data in it, but mostly it's a review of reports of activity in Moringa. And this has had, remarkably to me, I'm humbled, but 150,000 downloads since it came out. It's also been widely misquoted and misused by some unscrupulous juice companies that make little green cans of juice in the U.S. We won't name them. Although they've been referred to Johns Hopkins lawyers. So I superimpose on the trend in Google hits by the lay public, I suppose, the Google Trends. And then this is sort of where my bailiwick is. I wanted to look at number of scientific publications. So this blue line is peer-reviewed scientific publications. That's not Manny and me going down to the corner store and leaving a pamphlet with a 7-Eleven and saying, hey, you should buy Moringa. This is peer-reviewed scientific publications. And so since whenever the first publication was, probably 1897, there have been about 1,300 peer-reviewed papers on Moringa. Since 2005, there have been about 1,000 of them, which is remarkable. So incredible interest in the scientific community over the years. Now, I need to start to put my hypercritical hat on and be a jerk to some of you and try to help debunk some of the myths about Moringa. But so, of these 1,300 papers, only about 127 are in so-called high priority journals. As you're aware, there are good journals and there are bad journals. There's good everything and bad everything. And when scientists look at evidence that's published in papers, they really have to be very critical. And if papers are published in a poor journal that's poorly reviewed and that has a lot of mistakes and isn't very critical, then they tend to ignore it. There are still a lot of papers, over 100 papers in so-called high priority journals. Interestingly, when you do all the proper searches and use the proper keywords, I was only able to find 2 studies that talk about clinical trials with Moringa. And when I looked further, one of them was awful, was bogus, and the other one I think I'll talk about. And then I later found a few others, and all of a sudden we're starting to see a number of clinical studies come out. And in fact, I saw in the program today there is an abstract of what looks like a very interesting clinical study. I'm not sure who did that, but someone here, I assume, want to talk to them about it. So let me just go back. What I further did is I characterized these studies by the keywords, and probably not a surprise to any of you, antioxidant activity is the biggest hit. So there are a lot of studies in test tubes and some of them in animals that talk about the antioxidant activity of Moringa. More on that later. Down the line, antibacterial activity, anti-inflammatory activity, some specific phytochemicals like flavonoids you may have heard of, lipid peroxidation, anti-neoplastic, that's anti-cancer activity essentially, bacteria, antibacterial activity, and diabetes. Skip this is a summary. We can come back to this later, I don't want to take time on it now, but there's a whole hierarchy of clinical evidence that one can evaluate. And so, randomized controlled trials are sort of the gold standard of clinical trials. There have been none of them with any of the Moringa indications. Again, we can come back to this if you'd like, but for the sake of time, what I'd like to do is focus on a few types of studies that have been done with Moringa. I want to share with you a very interesting one in my mind on the nutritional value, and talk to you about antioxidant potency, antibiotic activity, some anti-diabetic indications, which I think may be among the more strong indications for Moringa, cardiovascular protective potential, anti-asthmatic potential, and chemoprotective potential. So, first, this is just one of, I think, two nutritional slides. There's a very, and my purpose here is just to highlight some scientific papers I can send to you, I can talk to you about them. I'm going to summarize a few of them here. Very recently, a study in which the nutrient composition of Moringa oleifera seed flour was examined. My impression is that most of you and most people talk about the nutritional value of leaves, the leaf powder. I found this interesting because they talk about seed flour. This is a Nigerian study. This just came out, this was just published a month ago. I certainly was not aware of this until I started to prepare for this talk. And this is a study in Burkina Faso in which severely malnourished children were treated with Moringa leaf powder. And I found this to be quite an interesting study. It's published in a decent journal. What they did, apologize for turning my back to you, but I have to read some of these slides myself. What they did is they fed 10 grams per day of Moringa oleifera leaves to an experimental group of 110 malnourished children between the ages of 6 and 60 months. So very young children. They fed them for 6 months. There was an experimental group that was fed Moringa, and there was a control group which received normal porridge. So these were children eating porridge. Half of them got the normal stuff, half of them had porridge with 10 grams a day of Moringa leaf powder. They monitored, they measured frequency of diarrhea, average duration of stay in a rehabilitation clinic, height, weight, mean upper arm circumference, wasting, underweight, etc. Some anthropometric measurements. I found the evidence to be quite convincing that there was quicker recovery of the Moringa-fed children for weight for age and weight for height. These are commonly used, most of you probably are aware, commonly used metrics of how well someone's pulling out of nutritional deprivation. There was greater improvement in wasting and underweight metrics. The average daily weight gain, and again, this is just 6 months on Moringa leaf powder, was 8.9 grams per kilogram of body weight per day on Moringa fed versus 5.7 for those on the standard porridge. The average, this is I think a very important metric, the average length of care at the inpatient rehabilitation unit was dramatically reduced in the Moringa-fed people, 36 days versus 57 days on standard porridge, even though both of these numbers are still too high. The accepted value is that they'd be in the clinic for less than a month. There was no significant difference in mean upper arm circumference. This is not surprising. It's a short-term study, and you wouldn't expect to see one. There's a profound change in the frequency of diarrhea. They reported that there was only an 8% incident with Moringa-fed people, children, and 80% with the standard porridge. This is, in my mind, huge. It's not emphasized really in the paper. It's repeated in a couple of places in the paper, but I found it very, very encouraging. And again, this is sort of hot off the press. Okay, here's where the tomatoes come out. People start taking shots at me. Let's talk about antioxidants, shall we? So, Scientific American is a very popular, well-read journal that lay people and scientists read. And a few months ago, they published this graph, and I went back and looked at the original paper that presented this. This is sort of the highest level of epidemiologic evidence. They took 68 of the most scientifically rigorous studies of antioxidant use, and they did statistical mumbo jumbo. Those of you who are economists probably know how to do this. I've been taught how, and I forgot the next day. But they do the statistical mumbo jumbo, and they determined that those people who had higher rates of mortality were antioxidant users. So these studies in various ways divided people that take antioxidants regularly and people that don't. So there are a lot of complicating, confounding factors in these sorts of studies, obviously. Are they smokers? Do they eat healthy? Do they get more exercise? All of that stuff. Most of these studies, the reason they specified rigorous studies is they picked the studies that controlled for these things well. So the bottom axis is tenfold increments of risk. So the way to interpret this is if antioxidant users and non-antioxidant users had equal risk of dying, they would all line up on this line. But the fact of the matter is that antioxidant users on the left do not have a lower risk of dying, they have a higher risk of dying. I mention this because a lot of you, I suspect, talk about the wonderful antioxidant activity of Moringa. I'm not trying to discourage you from doing that. I think it's fine to talk about it, and I think it's true. And in the test tube, and in animal studies, you've read studies, you can determine that antioxidant activity of Moringa is quite good. I warn you because as this sort of information becomes more and more well known to the lay public, it's going to be more of an uphill battle to convince people. If the only reason you have to tell them that they should eat Moringa or take a Moringa supplement is its antioxidant activity, you may be facing an uphill battle. Because I think the days the days in the sun, so to speak, for antioxidants may be waning, and I think you have to think critically about how you sell the product that you're selling. So for that reason, I think you want to consider other indications, and I'd like to share a few of those with you. Okay, I mentioned a couple of more chemical structures. I mentioned this mustard oil bomb. I already gave you this spiel and told you that Moringa includes it. So one of the isothiocyanates that Moringa produces from the mustard oil bomb actually was shown in 1990 by your countrymen in the Philippines to be quite a good antibiotic against a number of bacteria that one would want to kill. This is Dayrit and Willis North. So this isothiocyanate is one that we've looked at. It's the same one that kills Helicobacter, although in 1990 no one knew what Helicobacter, well, they were just learning what Helicobacter was. It was actually discovered in 1983, and the Nobel Prize was awarded for that discovery in sometime in the early 2000s, I think. So, strong antibiotic activity. Let's forget the structure. I should mention I'm mentioning this just because a lot of people keep talking about this compound in Moringa, pterigospermine. This was actually published upon extensively in the 1950s. Structures were given for it, and as recently as 1981, it was suggested to have anti-cancer activity. There's a paper that just came out recently in this Journal of Computational and Theoretical Chemistry, and I tried very hard to get through all the details of it. It's above my pay grade, as they say. It's not something I'm very good at analyzing, but it appears that the authors of this paper from the U.S. Just recently really are saying that this compound doesn't exist. So again, I'm saying that I'm trying to speak not as a scientist here, but as a friend of you, as someone who wants to sell Moringa products. To the extent that anybody talks about this compound, be careful. That's all I'm saying, because maybe it's smoke and mirrors. Maybe it doesn't actually exist. So let's take a look at diabetes. I mentioned diabetic indications. So in 1993, this didn't show up on the scientific search radar. Actually, I found this in other ways. 1993. A study was reported in which the glucose and insulin response in diabetic subjects was examined after taking a variety of Indian vegetables. And they fed people small numbers of, well, it says 421 subjects here. I think I have the data on the next slide. They fed them drumstick leaves, fresh, 50 grams, or curry leaves for bitter gourd. They did fasting blood draws before, at 1 hour, and at 2 hours. And these were non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus patients that were attending a diabetes clinic. So, yeah, I apologize. The number 421 I think was correct. It's a much smaller study. That's an error. So there were 6 type 2 diabetes and 6 controlled non-diabetic subjects. Moringa was added to a standardized meal after an overnight fast, and then they looked at postprandial after eating blood glucose, and then they looked at blood glucose after a 75-gram oral glucose loading. They did not find a difference in plasma insulin, but what they found is that only Moringa oleifera, the leaf powder, elicited significantly lower glycemic response than either a standard meal or the WHO glucose tolerance test. And bitter gourd and curry leaves did not work. You know, I had seen this study before, but hadn't really focused on it. And it was actually reviewed very recently by someone else in Canada, and who also highlighted this, I think, quite encouraging finding.